George Floyd, because George Floyd was an American citizen and George Floyd was a human being. George Floyd deserved humanity. And also, the system needed to be listening to George Floyd. Not just the police, but the prosecutors, the criminal justice system, the judges, the legislators, the president. America needed to be listening when George Floyd said, I can't breathe, because when he couldn't breathe, none of us could breathe. And so this is a tipping point. This is a tipping point. This moment is a tipping point to change America and see if America truly believes in the words of Thomas Jefferson, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Where America, that means black people too. Did that answer your question, George? Okay.
What do you say?
Two quick questions.
What do you say to the other three officers who did not get a read? What do you say to them?
You know, the family of George Floyd watched the video in agony. You've seen Phalonis, you've seen Rodney, you've seen Bridget, you've seen Terrence, you've seen his children. They are horrified at what they witnessed on this video. I think every human being who has any humanity in them are horrified what they see on this video. The only question is, why weren't those police officers horrified? And so the family's statement to those police officers are they are just as guilty for the death of George Floyd as Officer Chauvin. They all participated. And when people tried to help, the officer took out mace with Donald Williams and the EMT, the lay witness who were there. They threatened them that we won't let you give humanity. Even though we're not going to give humanity, we won't let you give George Floyd any humanity. And so the message is clear. Do your job to the people who are responsible for doing justice, because all the world is watching. 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 All the world is watching.
What do you think of the way the world has responded? What do you think of the way the world has responded, and also how America has responded?
The response of the world has been heartening to this family. The entire family have been very heartening. They receive it as a blessing that George Floyd's life mattered to more than just them. It is very important to note who George was. There are videos on social media that George believed in peaceful protests. Brandon Williams, who was George's nephew, who was like a father to Brandon, said that they talked almost every day, and during the Ferguson protests, during the Baltimore protests, and just recently during the Sacramento protests, you had George Floyd praying for peaceful protests. You know, the forensic scientists, Dr. Michael Biden and Dr. Alicia Wilson, who did the family's autopsy, said that George died because he needed a breath. And so I am imploring, along with George Floyd's family, for all of us to take a breath. For peace, let's take a breath. For justice, let's take a breath to heal our country. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George Floyd as we get ready to memorialize him this week and lay him to his final rest on next Tuesday. Let's take a breath this week to heal the country and to remember George. Let's follow George's example. He would have wanted peaceful protest. He wants everybody to use their voice, but he wants them to do it in a constructive way. So as we get ready to memorialize him on tomorrow at North Central University with all his family, I also want us to remember that Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was executed in the sanctity of her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, birthday would be on Friday. So let's take a breath for Breonna as well. Let's take a breath for Ahmaud Arbery as well. Let's take a breath for Terrence Crutcher as well. Let's take a breath for Pamela Turner, who was killed in Houston. Let's take a breath for Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's take a breath for Philando Castile, who was killed here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's take a breath for Laquan McDonald, who was killed in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a breath for Sandra Bland, who was killed in Texas. Let's take a breath for Natasha McKinney, who was killed by police in Virginia. Let's take a breath for Stephon Clark, who was killed in Sacramento, California. Let's take a breath for Corey Jones, who was killed in Palm Beach, Florida. Let's take a breath for Botham Jones, who was killed in his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Let's take a breath for Eric Gardner, who was killed in Staten Island, New York. Let's take a breath for Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a breath for Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina. Let's take a breath for Jamar Clark, who was killed here in Minneapolis. Let's take a breath for Typhil Nelson, Northside, Minneapolis. Typhil. Let's take a breath for Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson. Let's take a breath for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio by the police. Let's take a breath for Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was killed in Sanford, Florida. Let's take a breath for Emmett Till, who was killed in Mississippi. Let's take a breath collectively for all of the marginalized and disenfranchised and dehumanized people, whether black, brown, white, or red, who were killed unjustifiably, who were killed unnecessarily, and who was killed senselessly, because they are American citizens, one, they are human beings, two, and finally, we should all remember they are children of God. Thank you so much. We will respond to you when we get an announcement.
Benjamin Crump, the family attorney for George Floyd's family, the gentleman in the red shirt there, the maroon shirt to the left of Benjamin Crump, Quincy Mason Floyd, George Floyd's son, who delivered brief remarks here in Minneapolis as well. An impassioned case by Mr. Crump, not only for justice in the case of George Floyd, but reciting a long list, too long of a list, sadly, of other African Americans who have died at the hands of police in other cases. As you watch the family here in Minneapolis, I want to go straight to our Omar Jimenez, who is nearby, watching this incredibly emotional scene play out. And Omar, we know the Attorney General will make an announcement shortly. He has reviewed the evidence against all four officers. One has been charged. three have not. That could change a bit later today. You're right there in this remarkably emotional scene. Describe it for us.
Well, John, all of this is playing out in the exact spot where George Floyd took his final breaths a little bit over a week ago today, where Benjamin Crump, the family attorney, was speaking alongside Quincy Mason Floyd, George Floyd's son, as well. You heard the emotion in the words, but in their faces, again, you're reminded of the humanity in this story, the people that are truly affected by the loss of a father, the loss of a sibling, and so forth. Now, in regards to what we are going to see moving forward, you mentioned the charges or the decision on charges that we are expecting to hear later this afternoon. That was something Benjamin Crump, the family attorney, spoke on a little bit, saying that he has full confidence in the Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison that these officers, that Floyd, I should say, will be afforded justice to the full extent of the law. And that seems to be what they are pushing for in this. But even to go even further and get specific, even though we haven't heard which way these other three officers will go, whether they will face charges or not, Attorney Crump seems confident that we will know that these officers are charged before we have the Minneapolis memorial here for George Floyd in this city. As you see people here, as you see Floyd and the family making their exit from this site here, again, over a week after those final moments played out in this at this intersection. And what you may have heard over the course of some of those words was the reaction from the audience as well. There were chants at one point in support of George Floyd, and there was one line in particular that got everyone very excited because it landed just so significantly, saying that we're America, that means black people too. And that seems to be the message that places, not just here in Minneapolis, but it places across the country are using as a rallying cry for protests. Because let's remember, the protest that we have seen is not just about the George Floyd case. You just go down the laundry list of cases that Crump mentioned at the end of that press conference, from Breonna Taylor to Freddie Gray to Trayvon Martin. This is about generations of relations between community and police. John.
Omar Jimenez on the scene for us. And Van Jones, let's pick up right there where Omar left off. You could mention Michael Brown. You could mention Philando Castile. You could mention many